Good afternoon. I think we should begin. I apologize for my voice. I hope I won't speak for very long, so it shouldn't bother you for very long. Welcome to the panel, which is called, I'm sorry, Engaging the Political. And the panelists are, I'll just read the titles and then I'll give you the bio. The first one, Women, Conflicts and Politics, Assessing Margaret Egbo's Approach to Political Emancipation and Liberation in Nigeria. The second one, Contending Race and Party, Pauline Hopkins and the Politics of Partisanship in Boston, Massachusetts. The third, Coming of Age in an Age of Black Consciousness, Anne Moody's Daughterly Definition of Self, Recovering the Political Vision of Working Class African American Women. And just a brief bio of each person. Elizabeth Andrew-Essien, Dr. Andrew-Essien, lectures in the Department of Geography and Environmental Management at the University of Calabar in Nigeria. Dr. Andrew-Essien currently coordinates the Environmental Protection and Management Program in the at the university. She has delivered research papers on wide-ranging environmental management issues and political geography at conferences and symposia in Africa, Europe, and in the United States. Her research findings on conflicts, conservation, and development concerns have been published widely in international journals. Dr. Bisong also lectures in the Department of Educational Foundations, Guidance and Counseling at the University of Calabar in Nigeria. Her research interests include gender studies, learning processes of children and adolescents, and academic youth counseling. She has published several academic papers and has been involved with several international development agencies, NGOs, and governments as consultant, resource person, and facilitator. Dr. Brimmer is assistant professor in the Department of History at Vanderbilt University. She studies the history of gender and emancipation in the American South, with a particular focus on freed men and freed women's relationship with the federal government during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. She has received numerous awards for her work, including grants and fellowships from the Institute of American Cultures at UCLA, the North Carolina Society, the Sally Bingham Research Center at Duke University, and the Department of Africana Studies at the University of Notre Dame. Brimmer's article, Her Claim for Pension is Lawful and Just, representing Black Union widows in late 19th century North Carolina, is scheduled to appear in the June 2011 volume of the Journal of the Civil War Era. She was recently awarded a postdoctoral fellowship by the Ford Foundation and will be in residence at the University of Maryland in College Park during the 2011 to 2012 academic years. Professor Boisseau, is Associate Professor of Gender and Cultural History at the University of Akron in Ohio. She's the author of White Queen, The Origins of Imperial Feminist Gender and Women at World's Fair. The Origins of Imperialist Feminist Identity, published by Indiana University Press. And she's also the co-editor of Gendering the Fair, History of Gender and Women at World's Fair, which came out from the University of Illinois Press in 2010. She's also the co-editor of Feminist Legal History from New York University Press, and co-editor of New Orleans, a special issue on gender, the meaning of place and the politics of displacement, which from the National Women's Studies Association Journal in 2008. Her research exploring feminist production of self and identity in popular culture has appeared in Science, Gender and History, Third Space, and Women's History Review. Millington Bergeson-Lockwood recently defended his dissertation entitled Not as Supplicants but as Citizens, Race, Party, and African American Politics in Boston, Massachusetts, 1864 to 1903, at the University of Michigan. His work examines the intersections between racial and urban partisan politics in the late 19th century. Professor Abosede George is professor of history here at Barnard, and she focuses on African history. And my name is Veronica Gregg, and I focus on Anglophone Caribbean literature and intellectual history. Our proceedings will take place in the following manner. Each presenter has 10 minutes, and afterwards the respondent will respond, and then they will respond. They'll have 3 minutes within which to respond to the respondent. Okay, so please, round of applause. We'll go in the order it is listed.
Good afternoon. We're presenting a paper on women, conflicts, and politics, assessing Margaret Ekpo's approach to political emancipation and liberation in Nigeria. We will make this presentation in 2 parts. I'll take the first 5 minutes, while Dr. Nonso Bisong will take the second 5 minutes. Women and development in Nigeria, in society, societal development. Women and societal development over time. The contributions of women to societal development efforts cannot be overemphasized. And this is largely because of the fact that women over time have been responsible for a number of responsibilities, such as reproduction and childbearing, homemaking, homekeeping, coordinators as community, national and corporate or international managers, directors and administrators. In addition to this, women for quite a number of for long have been considered as agents of change within cultural, social, and political environment. Hence, the contribution of women numerically to the national capital package of any country cannot be overemphasized. However, the capacity for women to be highlighted as vehicles for development has remained sidelined in many societies, and the factors accounting for this include the prevailing traditional and parochial belief systems that have relegated women to backgrounds, the consideration of women as weaker or inferior sexes or second-class citizens. One other factor that has contributed to the relegation of women to the background has been the lack of access to land ownership, poverty, and funding, illiteracy, in addition to lack of awareness of the opportunities that are open to women and the unfavorable legislative frameworks that prevail within many societies. The consequence for this has been that women's social development has been shielded and relegated and often overlooked. And in addition to this also is the fact that the attainment of social-political initiatives have been suppressed, thereby hindering the opportunities for advancement and transformation in the various spheres of human endeavor. Globally, governments and various NGOs have made determined and significant efforts to break the bounds of marginalization over time. A few examples include the 1945 United Nations Charter on the Fundamental Human Rights, the 1947 United Nations Commission on the Status of Women, which created a conducive platform for promoting the rights of women. Other examples include the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which gave credence to the struggle for human liberation and emancipation from all forms of marginalization or oppression. Others include the first Intergovernmental Conference on Women, which took place in 1975, the 1980 Second World Conference on Women in Copenhagen, the Third World Women's Conference in Nairobi, Kenya, among others. Women and politics in Various theories have been put forward to understand, to explain, and possibly correlate the sometimes confusing nexus of male-female class/role stratification process over time. Hence, we have such theories as the marginalization theory, we have the equity and the equality and equity theory, feminism and the development theories, including the liberal feminism theory, in which all women are considered as capable of asserting their ability to achieve equality, sometimes we're making it possible for change to happen without actually altering the structure of a society. Women and politics in Africa. African women have proven their ability to promote and sustain the growth and development of nations over time. Historical recounts of African political leadership include and may not be relegated really to the queens of Ethiopia, Egypt, the Morenis of Ife, Queen Idia of Benin, Emotan of Benin, Queen Amina of Zaria, to mention but a few. We have, including that, Queen Kambasa of Ijolan, all in Nigeria, Funmilayo Oransom Kuti, and Margaret Ekpo, to mention just a few. However, this paper examines the contributions of Margaret Ekpo to the political emancipation of women in Nigeria. Who is Margaret Ekpo? Margaret Ekpo was born in 1914 in Creek Town, Odukpani, a part of Cross River State. Cross River State is located in Nigeria. She attended Standard 6 of the school leaving certificate in 1934. The unfortunate death of her father in 1934 terminated her goals of further education. Hence, she was forced to work as a pupil teacher in a secondary school. Owing to the prevailing condition, the prevailing cultural condition within the Nigerian setting at that point in time, she married a doctor, John Ekpo, in 1938. She moved with her husband to Aba. Margaret Ekpo's catalyst to the political liberation of women in Nigeria. Margaret Ekpo ventured into politics in 1945 at a period when the Nigerian woman was forbidden from participating in political activities or any form of political development. As a matter of fact, it was considered a taboo for a woman to be heard, not to mention taking part in any political discourse or development. How did it all start? Her involvement is likened to her husband's indignation and frustration with the then existing discriminatory colonial managerial policies and treatment that was meted out to the indigenous Nigerian doctors. As a specialist in conflict studies, some of the indices I looked out for was the factors that actually propelled her involvement in politics, and we can identify 3 basic factors as recounted by her husband. The first conflict indicator she put forward was the slow promotion of indigenous doctors in the hospital, the denial of incentives to the local resident doctors. They were denied any form of incentive. They were not placed, they were not promoted as at when due. And of course, the third was the absence of a platform for government officials to express any form of dissatisfaction. We find a situation where doctors who were working really hard had no medium through which they could air their grievances, or they had no platform upon which they could even say anything as it bothered their welfare. The top-down approach, which excluded a medium for stakeholder interactive forum, constituted a conducive ground for conflict and disagreement then. The only available medium through which the doctor, her husband in this instance, could possibly have aired his grievance was to the listening and attentive ears of his wife. Now, as you can see on the PowerPoint there, we have a star. As we go through, you see there are various stars, and for each of the points for which we have accorded a star, that clearly indicates that it's a breakthrough Margaret Ekpo would have made. And the very first star we have here is that Margaret Ekpo set out to address the problems confronting the indigenous doctors in a system where the decision-making process excluded the opinions of women. You can imagine a situation where you are forbidden to make any form of remark, you are forbidden to make any form of contribution to an existing system, yet despite that, she set out to address something that was virtually impossible. Despite being the only female present, Margaret Ekpo joined the political rallies that were being championed by the likes of Dr. Nnamdi Azikiwe in 1945 on the platform of the NCNC. The NCNC was basically concerned with the need for liberation, emancipation, and independence from all sorts of colonial leadership. All this Margaret Ekpo could readily identify with, thereby propelling her resolve to turn around the plight of men and women in her time. How did she do this? Margaret Ekpo gained her liberation from the political seclusion that existed then, and there we have a star. She gained her liberation by attending the political rallies. And one of the amazing or unique things about the rally was that she was the only female present. In a situation where it was considered a taboo to be there, she defied all that and still made out time to attend. I would want to believe that at the point in time, nobody must have spoken to her, no suggestion, no discussions or anything of the sort would have been demanded from her. But despite that, she made a concerted effort to keep on attending. And at a point in time, she was reintegrated into the forum as one of the stakeholders, thereby gaining her political freedom from the seclusion. In addition to this was the fact that Margaret Ekpo proceeded to enable other women in Eastern Nigeria to achieve liberation and emancipation through the organization of a Market Women Association in Aba, 1945. The essence or the concern of the association was basically to unionize market women and to create awareness of their rights within the city. This was not an easy feat, I tell you. One, she needed to get the support, she needed to get the participation of women, and of course, she was largely hindered by the socio-cultural norms and values that existed, the taboos that made it impossible for women to be involved in politics. What did she do? She simply adopted a very innovative indigenous approach, which we commonly referred to as a compulsion strategy. The compulsion strategy is basically concerned with monopolizing the sales of salt. Table salt is a common resource that is needed by virtually every family, and she monopolized this and made it possible for only women who were duly registered with the association to buy salt. The success of the association translated into a pressure group to address issues that related to the welfare concerns of women using various means, namely threats, demonstrations, and coordinated deliberations. The force of operation of the women is traced to the Iva Valley massacres of 1949 in Enugu, when colonial troops killed 20 striking miners agitating for a pay rise. The Aba Market Women Association mobilized other women across the country to protest the killings and subsequently ensured that justice prevailed, because these miners that were killed were husbands to the wives that she was fighting their cause for. In 1954, Margaret was nominated to the Regional House of Chiefs to represent the interests of women. Despite the debates surrounding her appointment, she excelled to occupy her position in the House. The landmark of this appointment presented the opportunity for other women to be appointed chiefs as well. So she broke that seal. By 1960, Margaret Ekpo headed the presidential position of the Women's Wing, the National Council of Nigeria Citizenry. That was the ruling party at that time. In spite of being a non-indigene, Margaret contested and won election in Aba North, an Aba North constituency, into the Eastern Regional House of Assembly in Enugu in 1962. Enugu was the regional capital. This position empowered her to fight for issues on the progress of women in economic and political matters, nationally and internationally, in the areas of transportation around major routes leading to markets and rural transportation in general. Locally, her concern was on market and transport development. She was based on fighting the gender-sensitive needs of women. She represented women's interests in the Nigerian Constitutional Conference in Lancaster, in London, which culminated in the independence of Nigeria in 1960. The intellectual discourse on Margaret Ekpo. The actions of Margaret Ekpo is rooted in the principles of liberal feminism. This was what guided her approach. And this was owed to the inequalities in her social cultural milieu. She sought to restructure the existing system for the institution of a change. Liberal feminism emphasizes the need for women to adapt to the structured configurations of a male-dominated society like hers. And Margaret Ekpo, in effect, adjusted her intents with the structure of the political profile in place then, while at the same time forged for a possible change that could be of significance to her personal and family development. While some studies have argued that the direction of thought undertaken by the liberal feminists could be likened to the killing of a fly with a sledgehammer, based on its exacerbated emphasis on equality, women, given the same conditions as men folk, are well able to function within any environment, as exemplified by the actions of Margaret Ekpo. She emphasized that complementary roles, and she recognized that complementary roles were performed by both men and women in the society, and given equal opportunities,
they should be promoted. Given the peculiarity of the African sociocultural trends, Margaret Atwood embraced the principles of liberal African feminism to restructure an unbalanced cultural demand where women were merely to be seen and not heard, or found in a position to contribute in decision-making processes. Margaret Atwood was conscious of the need to break these barriers by stepping forward to kickstart the sequence of events that earned her recognition in Nigeria. In conclusion, Margaret Atwood achieved her dreams. She was able to break that seal and encourage women into politics. Margaret Atwood is acknowledged, and a number of international, national, and local honors and awards have been dedicated to her. Namely, she was given the highest award in the nation, the Officer of the Order of the Niger in 1962. She was also awarded First African Woman by the African Women International Club, the Life Patron of the National Council of Women's Societies, the Life Patron of Women in Nigeria, the Queen Amina Prize for Womanhood in the category of Government and Politics by the Government of Nigeria in 1992. She owns an honorary doctoral degree of letters by the University of Calabar. She was also the Grand Patron of the Cross River State Women in Politics, and on, even the Leadership Award by the African Community Development Institute. And she was also the first female elected officer of the Female Parliamentary Association of Nigeria. With all these achievements, she has been recognized in the nation. There were lots of landmark edifices and institutions which have also been named after her, such as the Margaret Atwood Women Education Center in Calabar, the Margaret Atwood Refectory Hall at the University of Nigeria, Nsukka, the Margaret Atwood International Airport, amongst others. And you can see here the picture of the Margaret Atwood International Airport. So you're welcome anytime you come to Calabar. The authors will really want to, the presenters will really want to appreciate this body. We want to appreciate the Black Women's Intellectual and Cultural History Collective, and the other sponsors, which include the Columbia University Center for the Critical Analysis of Social Difference, Institute for Research in African American Studies, Institute for Research on Women and Gender, Institute for Social and Economic Research Policy, Office of the Provost and History Department, for the opportunity you've given the presenters to come to New York. This is indeed our first time in New York City. And the greatest of it all is to give us the opportunity to showcase this great icon of Nigerian history, a woman who has championed the cause of Nigerian women, a woman who has broken that barrier and shown that women have a lot, tremendous impact to make on the political history of our nation. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone, and thank you. I just want to continue to echo all the gratitude that has been forthcoming to all the organizers and to the university for hosting us. I want to talk today a little bit about Pauline Hopkins and the critiques of partisan politics in her novel Contending Forces. So I'm going to briefly begin by talking about Hopkins and the political context of Boston from which she emerges, and then give a sort of a pointed example from the novel that I think opens up larger questions about the intersections between politics of race and the politics of political parties. Pauline Hopkins, in her 1900 publication, Contending Forces, a romance illustrative of Negro life North and South, outlined her vision of the political dilemma facing African Americans at the turn of the 20th century. Hopkins, through her characters, argues that, quote, conservatism, lack of brotherly affiliation, lack of energy for the right, and the power of the almighty dollar, which deadens men's hearts to the sufferings of their brothers and makes them feel that if only they can rise to the top of the ladder, may God help the hindmost man. These are the forces which are ruining the Negro in this country. These, Hopkins emphasizes, are the contending forces dooming the race to despair. Present in this statement is Hopkins' pointed criticism not only of male political leaders who place personal success and advancement over unified racial uplift, but she also advances a political agenda which critiques a blind affiliation to the Republican Party. In her analysis, personal ambition and loyalty to party contended with calls for personal sacrifice for the greater good of racial uplift and civil rights. Hopkins' novel is steeped in a rising tide of African-American independent partisan political thought. Through her novel, she critiques blind loyalty to political parties and encouraged black men and women, where they could, to support candidates who championed African-Americans' political and civil advancement, regardless of party affiliation. While black women, like their male counterparts, continue to generally support Republican candidates, some, like Hopkins, expressed skepticism of partisan operatives and increasingly criticized partisan politics as a political strategy. While Hopkins' work spoke to a national audience, it was very much the product of black women's local political culture in Boston. Although prevented in serving in leadership positions in the city's large political organizations such as the Colored National League, black women were members of these groups, thereby enabling them to witness and participate in heated debates over political strategy and partisan affiliation. Black women were also engaged in debates over partisan loyalty through the women-run organizations like Josephine Ruffin's Women's Era Club and its newspaper, The Women's Era. Further, black women were important workers at the polls during Boston's elections and voted for members of the school board following their enfranchisement in 1879. The experience in political debate and as voters shaped their stance on the issues of African-American partisan affiliation and the political goals. Through the circulation of printed media like Hopkins' novel, these women were able to transcend local political environments and influence a national discussion of race and politics. Pauline Hopkins sought to shape national black politics through the publication of Contending Forces. Hopkins, who was active in Boston's political community as a member of both the Women's Era Club and the Colored National League, transformed her experience into a romantic narrative of black life in the 1890s Boston. I argue, however, that it is also an important commentary on African-American political culture and party politics. Hopkins spends several chapters in the center of her novel discussing the activities of fictional African-American politicians and the American Colored League. As a member of Boston's Colored National League, Hopkins likely based these chapters on her personal experiences. Indeed, the debates that emerge concern not only the proper response to racial violence, but also the African-American commitment to the Republican Party. In this way, her fictional account reflects the discourse of African-American politics taking place in her Boston reality. Contending Forces emerges out of a political and intellectual discourse that developed in Boston over the last half of the 19th century. In this way, her novel is not purely commentary on national trends of politics, but can be read as an informed critique of the local political reality of which she was a part of. Through her novel, Hopkins advances a political agenda which supports an ideology of independent politics and racial solidarity. The successful protagonist of her novel, Will Smith, is an outspoken activist who rejects partisan affiliation, while John Langley, who becomes the novel's nominal villain, is portrayed as an ambitious politician who compromises his early convictions against the Republican Party in exchange for a position from Boston's Republican leadership. Contending Forces, therefore, is a commentary on Boston's political culture and a caution to those who would choose party organization over racial pride and solidarity. Contending Forces generally focuses on Sappho Clark, a Southern migrant to Boston, and her encounters with the various members of Boston's black community. Through Sappho's contact with these men and women, Hopkins draws us into the homes, churches, and organizations of black Boston. While Hopkins takes her readers into places like Sappho's boarding house, a women's club meeting, and a benefit fair, she also spends several chapters focusing on John Langley, black politician and lawyer, and the activities of the American Colored League. Although Sappho is only peripheral to these central chapters, Hopkins takes the time to lay out the conflicts and competing political strategies of Boston's activists. Indeed, these chapters do very little narratively to trace Sappho Clark, this main character. So Hopkins almost, in some ways, steps out of a narrative to make these larger political critiques. So John Langley, described as a colored politician, emerges in fervent opposition to lynching and initially condemns Republican inaction. However, Langley moderates his position when offered a city office. Later, at the Colored American Club, Langley will endorse the Republican Party and urge restraint against lynching. This moderate position is encountered by Will Smith, the novel's hero, who takes a more radical stance. And by the end of the novel, Langley dies alone and disgraced, while Will Smith is eventually reunited with Sappho Clark, and the newly married couple happily sail off to Europe. We heard about leisure trips to Europe earlier today. So through Hopkins's portrayal of the triumph of Smith and the utter failure of Langley, the reader understands Hopkins's endorsement of Smith's political position and her condemnation of the moderate and loyalist Republican politics. In the larger paper, I discussed this broader political context, but I want to focus particularly now on Pauline Hopkins's account of John Langley's confrontation with the city official Herbert Clapp. And this occasion allows her to voice criticisms of the Republican Party and argue for black political independence and solidarity. Hopkins frames this discussion in the aftermath of a horrific Southern lynching, accounts of which were circulated in Boston and provided a catalyst for community mobilization. This meeting begins with Langley criticizing Republican leadership and declaring political independence. Hopkins, through Langley, responds to calls for patience and continued Republican support by arguing that the Republican Party takes African American votes for granted and once elected will do little to ameliorate the condition of black men and women while protecting the interests of big business. In the novel, Langley tells Clapp, quote, "It's votes you want, and after you get them, all the subsidies, corporations, and trusts are riding easily on the front seat of the coach for another year, and robbing and killing the black man can go right on." Langley further denounces the nominal appointments of African Americans made by Republican officials, and through her novel, Hopkins calls for African American voters to hold the Republican Party accountable in the face of national opposition. Through Langley, Hopkins asserts the collective strength of black voters. Quote, "There are 35,000 black voters in this state alone," Langley explains. "We can be organized if the work is done by the right ones and in the right way. We can help start a new party, if nothing more. We expect to fight you one of these days and knock the party clear over the ropes." In her decision to have Langley so clearly condemn the Republican Party and to advocate not only African American political independence, but the formation of a new party, Hopkins makes claims about the strength of black political organization and the power of black voters uniting under a banner of racial solidarity. In Langley's speech later, before this fictional American Colored League modeled after this Colored National League, Hopkins provides the opportunity to critique calls for political moderation and Republican loyalty. Langley, in a stark turnabout from his earlier statements, calls on African Americans to trust the leaders of the Republican Party and to work for black uplift at a reasonable pace. Langley proclaims, "Let us await the issue of events with patience, trusting in the fealty of our party leaders, putting faith in their sagacity to push our claims and redress whatever grievances we may have at a seasonable time." Hopkins's fictional League audience responds to Langley with, quote, "suppressed murmurs of discontent." Through her portrayal of the rejection of Langley's statements by the League, Hopkins voices her own displeasure and takes a position in favor of political independence. So, in Contending Forces, Hopkins sought to shape the public opinion about lynching and the dire state of American race relations. However, Hopkins also presented a vision for black politics and offered commentary on electoral politics as a political strategy. She maligned individual political ambition at the expense of the uplift of the race and advocated immediate collective agitation. By infusing fiction with political instruction, Hopkins sought to reach a reading public in an entertaining and disarming way. As she described in her introduction to the novel, it is the simple, homely tale unassumingly told, which cements the bond of brotherhood among all classes and all complexions. Fiction is of great value as a preserver of manners and customs, religious, political, and social. Through fiction, Hopkins brought her narrative of African American political life, rooted in Boston, and her ideas about African American political affiliation to a national audience. Thank you.
I'm impressed. That was exactly 10 minutes. Is this on?
Oh, thanks.
Is this on? Okay, I can't hear it. I also am very grateful to be here and for the organizers' efforts to bring the conference together, and I'll be really interested in hearing what other people have to say about Anne Moody, because I've been thinking about her for quite some time now. I've been teaching her for as long as I've been teaching. And how many people are actually familiar with Anne Moody's coming-of-age narrative? Many of you, but not everyone. So for those of you who are entirely unfamiliar, as a college student, Moody was a participant in the early desegregation of bus stations run by CORE, the Committee on Racial Equality. And through her membership in CORE, she met all the principal leaders of the civil rights movement of the late 50s and early 60s, including Medgar Evers and Martin Luther King. She attended the March on Washington, where King made his famous I Have a Dream speech. She participated in the lunch counter sit-ins and voter registration drives organized by SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, during Freedom Summer. She is figured in the iconic photo of the 4 college students who were showered with mustard and ketchup during one of the first lunch counter sit-ins in Jackson, Mississippi, and she was part of many other principal events of the movement in the first half of the 1960s. So Anne Moody is sort of boots on the ground. She left the movement in 1965, wrote her memoir while living with the Reverend Ed King, and published it in 1968. After that, Moody never published anything else about her civil rights work, and though she continued to write, she dropped out of explicitly political work and has been a bit of a recluse since then, despite the wild success of her narrative. It has been a standard text in women's studies, African American studies, and American history courses for 4 decades now. Actually, I don't have the figures, and I wish I did, because I think it's probably an understatement to say that hundreds of thousands of college students have read Coming of Age in Mississippi. Yet the book has received very little critical attention, and Moody herself is often overlooked in studies that focus on more high-profile individuals from the movement. I begin and end the essay that I submitted, a much longer essay, on Anne Moody's narrative with a quote culled from a rare interview with her in 1980, in which she said of her work, "I'm not interested in things as they literally happened, but more in the unconscious reasons why they happened." This quote is interesting to me, in part because when coming of age has been discussed in the critical literature on civil rights era memoirs, it has typically been discussed as a very literal, fairly transparent text. Students' attention is often drawn to the sort of nitty-gritty details of civil rights work and college campus activism that Moody provides the reader in the last third of her narrative. Moody has not been talked about as a writer all that much, with some notable exceptions, and certainly not as someone who has much to say that is theoretical, or even as someone all that intellectual. I argue it is our reading of Moody that has suffered from a lack of theoretical engagement and has resulted in a figuring of her as a passive object, a product of the civil rights movement, rather than an active agent who helped to create the movement. This belies Moody's vigorous effort to present herself as an authorized agent of historical change, not only as an activist, but as an author of a life narrative. A reading of her narrative as a passive eyewitness account of the past, rather than an active intervention in our understanding of that past, undermines the authority that Moody claims for herself as interpreter of historical events and theorizer of why and how those events came to pass. Moody's 1980 statement that what she is really interested in is the unconscious reasons why things happen should direct us to take a more careful look at her text and to look for the ways that her narrative clues us into the radical restructuring of Black consciousness that arguably counts as Anne Moody's and others of her generation's greatest achievement. If we look closely at Moody's text, what we find is that the bulk of the narrative is concerned with her early childhood and adolescence. Long before we get to any mention of the movement or her activism, we are treated to almost 300 pages of reminiscences of Moody's experiences as a teenager in junior and senior high school. Most of these chapters are passed over in critical treatments of the narrative. Though some feminist scholars have taken note of Moody's conflicts with her mother and the sort of isolated individualism that she exhibits in her portrayal of herself, Mostly these features are quickly explained away as a kind of perennial generation gap between black mothers and daughters, rather than focused on as a very historically specific generation gap between black mothers and daughters that, if examined closely, could help to explain the rise of the civil rights movement. The most consistent theme in Moody's early chapters is the empowered sense of self that she develops in these years and in the context of formal schooling. Moody portrays herself as the smartest, most attractive, and most athletic student in her school. She credits herself with being a disciplined hard worker, scrupulously honest, intuitive, bold, daring, and full of self-confidence. Perhaps what is most surprising in a teenage girl, as utterly reliant on herself for her sense of self-worth. Moody depicts her teenage self as dependent on no friend or no group of peers. She looks to teachers to confirm and reward her for her academic success, but she avoids all romantic entanglements, despite attracting much sexual attention to herself and inspiring crushes in seemingly every male figure who comes into contact with her, including all the boys in her classes, the only single male teacher in her high school, and most disturbingly, her stepfather. Though some of that attention is quite unwelcome, Moody tells us that she never blamed herself for it, nor let that attention risk her physical or emotional health. Moody's self-authored and empowered subjecthood is all the more highlighted by her portrayal of her mother as the exact opposite, a woman crushed by feelings of unworthiness, dependent on others for her understanding of herself, and unable to control her emotional life or sexuality. Where her mother obsesses about being rejected by lighter-complected relatives and hides from public view, Moody revels in her attractiveness and relishes any opportunity to stand out in school and in her community. My interest in Moody's narrative lies with the disjuncture between herself and her mother. And I just want to point out, this is a disjuncture that Moody draws at age 28, and she might not have drawn if she was 38 or 48 or 58, and it certainly is not the same image of her mother that I would imagine her mother would portray of herself. So we're only looking at this through Moody's eyes. But even that, I think really can tell us something. I argued that the dissonance they experience in their relationship highlights the objective conditions of Moody's coming of age that created the preconditions for movement. In specific, I see Moody's access to public secondary education as making the difference in the empowered sense of self that Moody achieves and that which her mother is denied. Many studies have discussed the introduction of public-financed secondary education in the South in the wake of the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision, mostly in terms of its inadequacy and segregationist character. White segregationists in the South hoped to stave off the legal implications of Brown by establishing, for the first time in many places of the Deep South, some provision for public schooling for African Americans. Though there are a few histories of education that cite Moody as evidence of the significance of education for black women in this period, mostly the historical context of the 1950s, beyond the radicalizing effect of the lynching of Emmett Till in 1955, goes unremarked upon in analyses of civil rights activism. In fact, mostly the civil rights movement itself is credited with producing a sense of self that distinguishes the generation of the 1960s. I think this puts the cart before the horse, and that Anne Moody's memoir allows us to pull in close to a subjectivity in the making to see just how it was that historical forces created an opportunity for a radical black female consciousness to form. Moody's contribution to the literature of the civil rights movement is that she chronicles those unconscious reasons why. She permits us to understand how her radical perception of herself could arise while coming of age in Mississippi at this time. Moody's very adamant throughout her text that the movement did not define her, did not even provide the opportunity for Moody to define herself. Yet most readings of Moody's memoir continue to repeat the notion that it was through the movement that she produced herself. If we take Moody the writer seriously, she appears not as a product of a movement that was created by other more famous and most often male leaders. Instead, she is a producer of movement. And most of what my longer paper details is all the evidence that Moody brings to bear on how school provided an opportunity for her to stand before the public, to achieve, to be rewarded, to believe in a meritocracy, however disillusioned she was after leaving high school about that meritocracy. It produced a sense of outrage and injustice that propels her forward into the public sphere. Moody is self-defined in something akin to a modernist radical individualism, but interestingly, she does not abandon her ability to embody the contradictions of being a raced and gendered person with being an autonomous subject. In her telling, she is not the object of impersonal forces, but neither is she untouched by those forces. She posits race and gender experience as the source of her authority over self and others, even while presenting a self that exists prior to and is able to interpret and create meaning from those experiences. She stands apart from the repression that produces anger in her, rather than is crushed or objectified as the end result of them. Moody exists, one might say, on the knife's edge of feminist subject formation, neither compelled to deny her bodily self and the repressive discourses that assign meaning to that body in order to assert herself as a subject, nor tied in some essentialist way to her gender and race in order to assert the authenticity of her experience. Moody accomplishes, through anger and resentment, and principally through separation from her mother, the production of an intellect and a psyche that is embodied but not reducible to her body. Moody allows us to historicize that private world of childhood and family that often is imagined as existing outside of history, along with the idea of subjectivity itself. Moody is a product of the post-war industrializing South, but paradoxically, that product is a fully autonomous subject empowered through disidentification, one unable to celebrate community and relation, true, but one able to contain the contradictions of an embodied female and black presence. This is not to say that Moody is a model of feminist subject formation. My goal is not to hold up Moody as prescriptive. Instead, Moody allows us to understand a point in time, a generation, and a movement, and to see how movement requires subjectivity as well as gives vent to agency.
Well, good afternoon, and again, I want to say thank you to the conference organizers for inviting me. It is truly an honor to be here. The papers thus far have been amazing, and I feel very honored to share my work on this panel. When I'm almost positive when the first line of my abstract for this conference was a question. It was a question and perhaps a challenge to myself. I asked the question, do poor black women have an intellectual history? And I raised that question because I wanted to challenge myself to think about the work that I'm doing at this moment, which explores in the broadest sense black women's relationship with the law and governmental institutions in the late 19th century, but specifically the US Pension Bureau. But for me to push myself to think about the work that I'm doing and how I might be in conversation with intellectual history. And so I need to set up a couple of things before I do what I was going to be a sort of a close read of one woman's case. If I'm lucky, I'll get through two. But I want to say that the case that I'll introduce you to is really sort of my reading, that my conclusions and arguments today are based on a reading of over 500 case files of African American women, mostly enslaved from the late 19th century South. This is a group of women, a large group of women who did not have the ability to read and write. And so they negotiated the Pension Bureau by building relationships with the black middle class, in the instance that I'm going to talk about in Eastern North Carolina, and also forging their own women's networks. So the context for which they're working within, the pension system, where they file these claims, is set up in this way. In 1866, the federal government retroactively recognizes slave marriages. This sets up a pathway for formerly enslaved women to begin to claim and define rights for themselves. Along with that policy, there's an assumption for all widows that if a woman remarried or was living with a man, she was to report it, and if it was found out, she was to immediately, she would immediately be taken off the pension rolls, okay? And that was the case for all widows, not specifically African American women, but you can imagine how this must have come down and played out in their cases. And then in 1882, we have a more formalized policy where lawmakers are trying to sew up a gap, not specifically targeted at African American widows, with the policy of August 7th, 1882. And this is a law that uses sexual morality as a basis for determining women's eligibility for survivor benefits. And it was used to, and it could deny or terminate a widow's pension if she was involved in a sexual relationship with a man or deemed sexually immoral. Okay. And so this is the context for which I begin today, and I introduce you to a woman named Mary Lee. I met Mary Lee very early in my research, my long days at the National Archives several years ago. And so where we enter her story, she's on the pension rolls. And the day is Thursday, May 10th, 1894. About 10 o'clock in the morning, Emmett D. Gallen, a special examiner appointed by the Special Examination Division of the United States Pension Bureau, discovered that Mary Lee, a 44-year-old black Union widow, had buried a child earlier that year. He believed that Lee was in violation of the law of 1882 and went directly to her home. As I said earlier, the law of 1882 used sexual morality as a basis for determining a woman's eligibility for a pension. And it also would deny or terminate a widow's pension if she was involved in a sexual relationship. When Gallen arrived, he found Mary Lee talking to Benjamin Ragland, a disabled veteran, on the front steps of her home. Gallen began questioning Mary from the street. "I want to know how long your husband been dead. You had a child, you buried him." Mary responded, "I had no child of my own by birth, but I had one given to me by city authorities." Gallen called her a liar and told her he would throw her off the pension roll. She told him, "I had no men," and go away. She then went inside and shut the door. 6 days later, she responded by filing charges of malicious slander against Gallen at the Craven County Courthouse and lodging a formal complaint with the United States Department of Interior. This paper examines the public conflict between Mary Lee and examiner E.D. Gallen and the larger political context it unfolded within, for what it may tell us about poor black women's political vision. It begins in 1894 on the steps of Mary Lee's home in New Bern, North Carolina, when she publicly challenged Gallen's authority. I'm then going to make a shift and introduce another woman into this talk today if there's time. Black women's interaction with the United States Pension Bureau and their claims on the government are rarely mentioned in standard histories of the Pension Bureau. While historians of emancipation have only recently begun to understand women's struggle for recognition within the system. Eastern North Carolina, especially New Bern, a port city in Craven County, had long been an important staging ground for black political struggles, but it was especially so for black Union veterans and their families in the late 19th century South. Poor black women like Mary Lee were central to these developments. Not only did they build a direct relationship with the United States Pension Bureau and petition it for benefits, they registered their complaints about the law of 1882, which sanctioned examiner intrusion into their private lives. In historic interpretations of late 19th century African American, Southern, and women's political history, the political battles black Union widows waged, especially after 1877, are altogether or mostly invisible. The result has been a story of political struggle that fails to take account of poor black women's political vision, their longstanding relationship with the federal government, and the impact these relationships had on the formation of turn-of-the-century black communities. Local clashes, like the one we saw with Mary Lee and E.D. Gallen, were by their very nature about power and politics. These conflicts, I argue, might be best analyzed through what Nancy Fraser calls the politics of need interpretation. According to Fraser, needs talk, and here I'm quoting, appears as a site of struggle where groups with unequal discursive resources compete to establish their respective interpretations of legitimate social, economic, and political need. Needs talk carries a political dimension when, but only when, it's contested across a spectrum of different discursive arenas and a range of different publics. And so by looking at the case, and the cases that I have sort of in my collection, I suggest that we can begin to recover this political language or discourse from these pension files. Born in Bertie County, North Carolina, roughly 8 miles from New Bern, Mary Lee, born Williams, migrated to the Trent River Camp, later called James City, a freedmen's camp the Union Army had set up outside of New Bern, where the wives and mothers of soldiers settled during the war. There she met a young Simeon Lee who enlisted in the Union 35th Regiment of Union Colored Troops around 1861. When he was discharged in 1866, they married about a year later. About 12 months after, or 9 months after that, they had a child. The child died maybe 3 months after he was born. It was a young boy. And then Simeon died shortly thereafter. So Mary confronted a good deal of sorrow early in her life around this wartime period. But she decided not to marry again and began a new life on her own, working as a washerwoman, housekeeper, and a farmhand. Sometime after 1870, she moved with her stepfather in an area with a number of prominent black professionals and black veterans and their families. Here, I believe, Mary more than likely learned she was eligible for a widow's pension of $8 a month. But she really didn't apply until the 1880s, mid-1880s, around 1885, because she had no money to hire a lawyer or prepare the papers. She was eventually pensioned in 1892. And she also continued to participate very much in this local pension process that comes into being in this region because you have so many Union soldiers concentrated in this area. So in 1893, and on 2 separate occasions, she was called upon to establish the marriage dates and identify children for women who, like herself, hoped to secure benefits. In these cases, examiners described her as an unreliable witness. But when E.D. Gallion arrived at Mary's home 1 year later, she would show herself infinitely more resourceful. Because of her tenacity and savvy understanding of the Pension Bureau's rules and examination process by 1894, Mary was able to successfully respond to Examiner Gallion and protect her status on the pension rolls. In her appeal to the U.S. Pension Bureau, she used the bureaucratized language of the state to undermine the power of the federal examiner. Weaving together her identities as a freedwoman, a Union widow, and a respected member of her own community, Mary presented herself as an aggrieved widow who Gallion publicly shamed. She directly challenged the notion that she was, quote, a liar having men in an affidavit when she said, I've not given birth to a child since the death of my husband or kept a disrespectable house. Examiner Gallion, of course, believed that Mary Lee, in fact, had been coached by her attorney, the formidable Frederick C. Douglass, not the abolitionist leader. And he believed that he coached her through the whole ordeal. And if this is true, then Mary Lee proved herself a remarkable student, reversing the usual power dynamic between Union widows and local bureau examiners when she filed charges of malicious slander against E.D. Gallion at the Craven County Courthouse. Mary's chief objective was to vindicate her claim and her honor and respectability within her community. When she filed her letter of complaint with the Commissioner of the Department of Interior, she sought to maintain her status on the federal pension roster, and with Douglas' assistance, she did this. And she did this by positioning herself as a worthy widow and also challenging the Bureau to reprimand Examiner Gallion by exposing his misconduct. And I should say that Gallion got dismissed within several months, about 6 months after she filed that complaint. I can't link it completely to her complaint, but I like to think it was because of it. I want to shift gears sharply and introduce you to another woman by the name of Charlotte Banks. Charlotte Banks' pension file came to the attention, in 1907, her case file came to the attention of the Department of Interior. She was then a 75-year-old freedwoman, and it came to their attention because of her successive appeals for federal intervention into her case. Charlotte, like Mary, had also been recognized as a widow. She was married to a man by the name of Caesar Banks, and unlike Simeon, Caesar Banks died in service. The couple separated around 1861. Charlotte also settled in the Trent River camp, and at some point during this settlement, Charlotte actually began to start a new relationship with a man named David Holloway. After the war, Charlotte, like many free people, went before the local courts and secured a marriage license in accordance with the North Carolina law, which really forced people to do that or face fines. 2 years after marrying David Holloway, however, Charlotte also filed an application for benefits as the widow of Caesar Banks, and in 1872, she was recognized as such. Several months after collecting her first check from the pension office, a local bureau examiner notified Charlotte that she had violated the bureau's rules by marrying and simultaneously collecting benefits. The examiner came to her home, accompanied her to the Freedmen's Bank, where she had an account, and demanded that she turn over all her money on the spot. Threatened with charges of fraud and jail, Charlotte complied. This is exactly the kind of example that I want to push myself on. What is it exactly does this mean? What was Charlotte doing? And what can we learn, and how can we read this incident? And this is what I've come up with. When Charlotte petitioned the federal government in 1868, it seems to me that she envisioned a state that recognized a much broader construction of union widowhood than articulated in the Bureau's rules. Such a definition would have obliged the federal government to recognize women's multiple identities and non-nuclear family formations as legitimate, and, as a consequence, allow the possibility of greater recognition of Black women and families into the pension system. Beginning in 1890, Charlotte was kind of quiet after 1873, but beginning in 1890, she started petitioning the federal government again to open up her case. And she did that in 1890. She did that again in 1904, and then she was successful. But part of her strategy also meant that she began to tailor her case to meet the Bureau's marriage standard to recover her benefits. The strategy was no doubt successful, but by doing so, she appeared to leave behind her broad definition of marriage and family and adopt a more limited vision of the state. In 1904, the commissioner ordered, in fact, an examiner to investigate her case to resolve this question of marriage. While Charlotte testified before the examiner, her phrasing here was more distinctive and specific than what appeared in her earlier case. Whereas in 1873, Charlotte allowed for the simultaneity of her identities as a married woman and a widow to overlap, she now adopted the Bureau's own language to make her point. She identified a definitive beginning and ending to her relationship with Holloway. And here I'm using her language. I swear I never lived a day with David Holloway before we got the 25-cent license. She also said she was living as the lawful widow of Caesar Banks when she secured the license. Unfortunately for Charlotte, her strategy did not work. The Commissioner of Pensions never reinstated her name on the pension rolls, but she did continue to petition until she died sometime after 1910. In offering the example of Mary Lee and Charlotte Banks, I've tried to show the way that poor Black women challenged the Bureau's definition of marriage, union widowhood, and examiners' attempts to position them as sexually immoral. But I also use these examples to talk about and think about how we might use their case files to recover their vision of the state and their concept of inclusion. By recovering the process by which poor Black women like Mary Lee and Charlotte Banks engage the federal government, I think new political languages become apparent and a more complicated story of turn of the century, late 19th century political culture emerges. Thank you.
Thanks everyone for a great set of papers. And they're all really different in interesting ways and feature very different kinds of women. And in thinking about how to discuss them, I of course thought of my own work, which is on elite Black women in Lagos that I tracked from the final years of the 19th century into the later mid-20th century, particularly in relation to their social reform work among the Lagosian poor. And one of the central concerns of my own work is the question of class and the ways that class was deployed in their relations with the poor, as well as with poor Lagosians, as well as in their relations with European colonial agents. So I've been thinking about, intersecting identities, right? Intersectionality and some of the critiques of it, and the relationships of both with context. Seems to me that local communities, local cultures, local logics of gender, generation, race, class, hierarchy, etc., are all hugely influential, important for determining what intersecting identities will amount to in a given context, and for defining the possibilities for various women's political engagements. In the papers, I see a similar deep concern with intersecting identities among Black women political actors, as well as a deep concern with contexts and how different kinds of political contexts ranging from disenfranchisement to full citizenship function differently to enable or to curtail the political possibilities for Black women intellectuals, and then become important for us as scholars evaluating in our evaluations of how these women engage with politics. So I'm going to start with the last paper, actually, which is Professor Brimmer's article on poor Black women in the post-Reconstruction South and recovering the political voices. In this article, Professor Brimmer seeks to recover the political voices of poor Black women in the American South during the post-emancipation era. Using the archives of the Veterans Administration, she unearths the struggles of poor Black women or poor Black Union widows to assert their rights and citizenship against the federal government that their husbands had died for. One of her key questions is, how did poor Black women deal with a hostile state via its exclusionary pension bureau, and what was the impact of their strategies of engagement on their political trajectories and on their own class interests? The article opens in 1894 on the stoop of Mary Lee's home, where the Pension Bureau examiner, Emmett Gallion, is there to publicly shame her by accusing her of being a liar, being immoral, having had children after her husband had passed, and by inference of cheating the system. It proceeds by examining Mary Lee's formal petitions and complaints against Gallion for his unsubstantiated accusations. It examines her active support as a legal witness for other poor Black women in her community who were being similarly threatened with excision from the pension rolls. By savvily adopting the language of the state, Mary Lee is able to defend her claim to her husband's pension and to help others do the same. Poor Black women, therefore, working in solidarity with one another and guarded against the exclusionary machinations of a racist and sexist pension bureau, use the Pensions Bureau's own notion of the moral and deserving woman as one who remained eternally wedded to a ghost to defend their rights to compensation and assert their citizenship in the new union. By 1901, a renewed campaign of expulsions is underway in the Pensions Bureau, and Mary Lee and poor Black women like her have to fight again, this time against not only the federal government, but also against the middle-class Blacks who seem ready to forsake poor women like Mary in order to, quote, rebuff white Democrats' claims about Black sexual danger and dishonorable Black homes. So Mary Lee is once again challenged by another pension examiner, and the second time her campaign seems to have been less successful. Professor Brimmer concludes that mounting gender and class conflicts among Black residents ultimately undercut Black union widows' attentions to issues of poverty and work that they were working on in earlier years, as they're inclined to use the language of the state and of the middle class to make their claims of citizenship and to protect their status in the post-disenfranchisement years. So in short, their political vulnerability, compounded by the precarious economic and status positioning of poor Black women, serves to disable their political activism as a class-based group, okay? So here she's making a stark distinction between the politics of the Black middle class and the politics of poor Black women. And I think she's asserting that there's tensions between the two are related to what becomes their shared experience of disenfranchisement. I think what I was really interested in was hearing more about this relationship between the weakening of a more collectivist politics, which is identified in the article with poor Black women, or exemplified in the strategies of poor Black women, and a different kind of politics adopted by middle-class Blacks, and the convergence between the tensions of between these two styles and the advent of disenfranchisement for Blacks as a whole. Right, so hearing a bit more about that. The next article I'm going to discuss is Bisong, Professor Dr. Bisong and Dr. Andrew-Essien's fascinating article on Margaret Ikwo. So the question that Bisong and Andrew-Essien are asking is, what motivated Margaret Ikwo to go into politics, and what marked her approach as a politician once she entered this realm? In her memoirs, Margaret Ikwo explains that her political career as being born of a selfless desire to serve her nation, one that despite its rewards took away from her ability to serve her family. With bitterness, she wrote, and this is a quote from the article, "My regret in life is that I sacrificed myself politically for this nation and then forgot myself. I left all my children, my husband, my job, and plunged very deep into politics, but here I am today." Those whom we fought for, the Nigerians whom we fought for, the Nigerians we cared and cared for, the Nigerians we tended for, have all forgotten us. I hope Nigerians of this present generation will not forget those other women who are playing deep into politics, end quote. This quote, I think, is really rich in its comments on various forms of betrayal. The nation state and its betrayal of citizens like her who gave it their all and forgot themselves, the betrayal of her fellow Nigerians who failed to honor those women politicians from the independence era who put the political above the personal, the nation above the family. And most poignantly, what she felt was that she had betrayed her family, right, for the sake of having a political life. Much of the article is devoted to a narrative about Margaret Ikwo overcoming various challenges in order to be politically active. And the one that was emphasized in the talk was the challenge of the silencing of women in Nigerian communities and societies, cultures. In the nationalist era, that Bisong and Andrew-Essien argue, women's ideals were presented by women. And they argue that this was a practice born of, quote, ethnic ignorance, which had the effect of, quote, alienating women from effective, active participation in decision-making situations of the family and society at large. This view of African cultures, Nigerian cultures, Igbo cultures, seems as structurally silencing women and marginalizing them from decision-making organs is somewhat opposed to a kind of a long-standing project of scholars like Nwando Achebe, Misty Bastian, Judy Allen, Van Allen before them, who have looked at parallelism, right, in traditional political systems, as well as the historical presence, if rare, of women chiefs in precisely this area that Margaret Ikwo is coming from, right? So for those who know a bit about African women's history, precisely the area that she lives in for a long time with her husband, Aba, is the site of one of the most radical women's political uprisings, right, in Nigerian history. This is the 1929 Aba Women's War, right? So if she's from the land of the Women's War, where clearly women have outlets, right, for political engagement and asserting their public power and political power, I would want to hear more about this kind of characterization of the political traditions that Ikwo comes out of, right? How does these square away with these other ideas and the new scholarship of the actual political position of women in Igbo land, right? So how do you balance the narrative about Ikwo's challenges and her triumphs over them versus a kind of a construction of African, Nigerian, or Igbo political systems as being structurally marginalizing of women? The next paper that I want to discuss is Dr. Bergeson-Lockwood's portrait of Pauline Hopkins and the politics of partisanship in Boston, Massachusetts. In the article, Dr. Bergeson-Lockwood portrays Pauline Hopkins, a writer and a race woman in early 20th century Boston, and her novel Contending Forces, as a critique of partisan politics among blacks in early 20th century Boston. Hopkins's writings, the novel Contending Forces and her essays in various Black newspapers and magazines exhorted Black Bostonians to eschew blind, quote, blind loyalty to political parties and to, quote, support candidates who championed African-American political and civil advancement regardless of party affiliation, end quote. Bergeson-Lockwood argues that while Hopkins' work spoke to a national audience, it was very much the product of Black women's local political culture in Boston. This particular part of the paper was really interesting to me. So what we gather about their Black women's local political culture in Boston was that although they were prevented from serving in leadership positions in political organizations, Black women were granted membership in these groups, which enabled them to participate in debates over political strategy or partisan affiliation, as well as to serve the organizations in various capacities. Further, Black women were important as poll workers, and they also ran for elections in Boston following their enfranchisement in 1879. Thus, Bergeson-Lockwood argues that their experience in political debate and as voters shaped their stance on issues of African-American partisan affiliation and political goals. I was interested in what their position as women, their kind of gendered position within these political organizations, what role that played in perhaps shaping their stance on issues of group politics and political goals. What seems to be less emphasized, but maybe quite interesting, is about the environment that shapes Black Bostonian women's politics. Is their experience of perhaps being frustrated? I don't know if this is a possibility, at least in terms of holding positions in Black organizations. It's interesting that to me that they are able to serve in various capacities, but not able to occupy a kind of a leadership position, right? So what does that kind of marginal insider or critical insider position within the political establishment, how does that shape their politics or their critiques of the two major political parties and their relations and the ways in which leading Black politicians seem to be following them uncritically. So, does that? Mm-hmm. The last paper I'm going to discuss is Professor Boisseau's reading of Anne Moody's autobiography. Professor Boisseau's article offers a rereading of Anne Moody's autobiography, not as a record of a period in time, but as an accounting of one woman's intellectual and political formation. The autobiography is frequently read as, quote, a testament to a very public and explicitly political set of historic events that were central to the civil rights movement of the late 50s and 60s. And Professor Boisseau asks, how might it be read with a refocusing onto the person of the writer herself? Boisseau proposes that we step back and read the autobiography as Moody wrote it, as primarily, for 2/3 of it, an account of her youth and childhood, and only secondarily as an account of how that background manifested in her activist career as an adult. What would it mean to read the childhood memoirs of a person who became an activist as the childhood memoirs of a person, period? In her childhood, about this kind of individualist sense of the self that seems to be in tension with the canon of the civil rights narratives. I suppose generally, for all the papers, I see class and generation emerging as significant factors in the analyses of these politicians and political activists. Each of the central women actors, Margaret Ickle, Pauline Hopkins, Anne Moody, and Mary Lee, are pioneers of one sort or another, and they appear to different degrees as heroic pioneer figures. The articles are all set in a period of significant social and political flux. You have the nationalist and then the independence era in Nigeria. You have post-emancipation and disenfranchisement in North Carolina, Black consciousness and civil rights in the Moody article, and Reconstruction in Boston. And each of the women is caught up in a mix of fundamental political transformations at the national level, shifts in their more local contexts and in their particular communities that are informed by these developments in national politics and by changes within themselves. And each of them is kind of bridging a kind of a before and after period of some sort. There's also a strong individualist thread in the articles, and this may be due to the biographical approach, but it may go beyond that. Ikpo, for instance, sees herself as a representative of women, even though she had to blackmail them to act in their own self-interest by forming a union. And Moody's autobiography is all about herself, in a sense, her heroics as a young child, her individuality of thought, and the inevitability of her career as an activist by the time the 60s roll around. In Moody's autobiography, the generational theme is layered by a more explicit awareness of being of a different, and in her mind, a stronger, smarter, braver generation than her mother. Pauline Hopkins is a leading figure in the Black Boston political scene. And through her book, she also pioneers a national dialogue among Blacks that is more commonly linked to her successors, Washington and Du Bois. The articles about Margaret Ikpo and Mary Lee draw out a key tension in the heroic pioneer narrative, which is the relationship between the individual who rises to the fore as the hero and the base that places her in that position. Here's where the issue of class-based concerns and class differences, class tensions in the local context become hugely important for how we evaluate Black women's engagements with politics. I thought also of a question that came up yesterday that was posed by Professor Lightfoot, this question about the liberatory. And I was thinking about what we want to see when we look at Black women intellectuals or acting in a political capacity, and how historians, what kind of grand narratives historians are going to develop out of all these, our inquiries into women's intellectual and political history. So tours are kind of a grand narrative of the political engagements of these women. How would each author, how would each of you characterize the politics of these women? Are they liberatory politics? Are they engaged in a feminist politics or in a radical politics or something else, right? And that's it, thank you.
I can start because I also thought a lot about, first let me say thank you for your wonderful reading of my paper and all the papers. But I thought a lot about Professor Lightfoot's comments yesterday, a lot of comments yesterday, but certainly that stuck in my mind because, in particular with Mary Lee, and I do think that she loses a lot when she adapts the language of the Bureau. And I think ultimately that's the point that I'm trying to make, that while they are able, these individual women, by adapting this language, are able to stay on the pension rolls, that they also lose the sort of broad focus of their claims in the early period when they're talking about issues of work and motherhood and really sort of framing the sort of broad vision of the state. But I also want to say that on the same note, I mean, Charlotte Capehart is the type of file that someone might put to the side because ultimately she's taken off the rolls in 1870s. And most of the women that I'm looking at now, and particularly in light of this conference, and sort of challenging myself to think about why these women are being taken off the rolls, well, the women who aren't adapting the language of the Bureau, the women who aren't adapting this narrative of the state, are the ones who maintain this broad vision of inclusion, but ultimately don't find the kind of success in the Bureau. And I think that's the problem with the literature on the pension system as it's situated right now. And so that's the kind of intervention that I want to make.
Thank you. If I can just add something. In my thinking, I would just want to correct a little impression there, where you said Margaret Ikpo had to blackmail the women. And I'm thinking, and in my mind, I want to believe that actually she wasn't blackmailing the women. Rather, she was blackmailing the men. Because if the women, had wanted to purchase some salt and they couldn't get it, then they would have maybe protested, or there would have been some form of, disagreement, but whereby the women were unable to get it and they reached out to the men, giving the men a reason why that could not be purchased, in order for the men to release them. I think the blackmail was more targeted towards the men, allowing their women, and like I had recounted before, this was a time where it was considered a taboo for a woman to even speak up, for a woman to be seen. And I think the women at that point in time actually had a yearning. They were willing, they understood the cause, they appreciated it. And secondly, coming from somebody who was an outsider, she moved from Cross River, and if you understand the setting in Cross River State, the traditional setting whereby, you just can't, there are certain things you can't do. And then in addition to that is the fact that she came from a strictly religious home, whereby, one would not expect her to be involved in such. So I think one of the things she did was to engage the women effectively, such that they were able to in turn take that back home. Else the men would not have allowed their women eventually, to go and register and enable the associations to become so powerful. Thank you.
Okay. I just want to say something in relation to the point she has made, talking about blackmailing the women. I think what she was doing, she was really sensitizing them. She wanted them to rise up. And again, like she said, the women themselves were already fed up. And I want to paint a vivid picture of the cultural situation in the period that Margaret Ebo operated upon. You see, when Margaret Ebo, the period that Margaret Ebo was talking about was the period when, in the history of Nigeria, women were being totally subjugated. The environment never allowed women to be seen, not talk of being heard. Although the levels of the subjugation differed from society to society. In Nigeria we have the northern part, the eastern part, and the southern part. And what Margaret Ebo did was, it now began to sensitize the women. And again, when this thing was happening was when the colonial masters came. It coincided with the period when the colonial masters came. When they came, they also helped to subjugate the women. Though they stripped the men of their titles, but they made sure they perpetually put the women down, because they didn't want what was happening in Europe to happen in Nigeria. Because at that time in Europe, women were already beginning to speak for their rights. So they didn't want a repetition of what was happening in Europe to happen in Nigeria. So it was a perpetual program to put the women down. And they began to establish schools for only the men. They trained them as interpreters, as houseboys to the colonial masters. They never established any school for the women. And so the women in their various societies began to agitate. While Margaret Ebo was in the East agitating, there were other women like Fumilayo Ransom Kuti in the West. She also mobilized the women in 1946, the Abiokute Women Association, and they began to agitate. So, and they, just because we are just working on Margaret Ebo, they were working hand in hand. They were aware of what was happening. Margaret Ebo was in constant touch with Fumilayo Ransom Kuti. And so they were, encouraging themselves in what was happening. And they were going around sensitizing women all over of the need to sit up and demand for their political rights, and the fact that they have a right to take decisions in the running of their various societies. And then you said something about, did I hear the betrayal of the last statement? You were quoting Margaret Ebo, what she said from our paper, that they shouldn't forget, the Nigerians shouldn't forget her leaders and those who champion their cause and all that. Anyway, I think what made her to say that was, Nigeria, we are under the military rule for a very long time. And the military rule was male-dominated. They were not female-friendly at all. In the military rule in Nigeria, we never had any female military president. We never had any female commissioner, no female in the ruling council. It was all men, and they perpetually suppressed the women. So she was making reference to that that they shouldn't forget, because it was like sitting down and watching the military and watching all that she has labored for the women going down. Women were again, when they think that it was the colonial masters who were responsible for putting the women down. Now the colonial masters are gone. We should join hands with the men to begin to take decisions politically. And now, here the military putting the women down. And that was the reason why that statement came up.
I'll speak to this idea of frustration. And I think that what you've seen with Hopkins and in Contending Forces is frustration on two levels. I think there is definitely a sense of frustration with male leadership, that the male political leaders of the city are, in Hopkins's mind, compromising the good of the race for the party. But I think Hopkins is also tapping into a frustration with United States politics. And so I want to think about the ways in which, she's not just speaking to the sort of local situation in Boston, but I think she's looking at a national political climate in which the Republican Party is increasingly marginalizing the interest of black voters. And so I think that, through her novel, she frames it as this, critique and vilification of a black male politician. But I think she's, making two arguments there. I think she's making one for the need to hold these local black male leaders accountable, but then additionally to a national audience making commentary about a frustration with national Republican politics. Even though on the national level, women aren't voting for a party. But I think there's a sense that Hopkins is still engaged in those debates on that level.
Yeah, I actually really am intrigued by your question, which I think it was, is there a relationship between Anne Moody's radically individualist stance and the fairly marginal way that she's remembered as part of the civil rights movement? And I think the answer is yes, but not only because of the way she writes about herself in her autobiography, but maybe even because of the way that she cut herself off. If we take what she says to be literally true about how she conducted herself during her years of activism, she always held herself apart from relationships with others in college and then afterwards in the movement. And then in the writing of it, she distinctly holds herself off and to criticize, virulently criticize the male elite of the civil rights movement. And then she kind of disappears from view nearly. So there isn't anything to keep her in front of the spotlight, or in the spotlight, except for this narrative, which gets assigned over and over and over again. And I think it gets assigned because we all know as teachers when we assign Anne Moody that students will read it, and they will read it because they're caught up in the story of this individual who then they identify with as an individual. So I do think her individualism is at the crux of the issue, both for why her memoir gets read, but why she is almost read out of the history. And I am really struck by how in all of our work we are all struggling with this issue of biography and individuals, and how do individuals stand out from the rest? How do structural forces produce them, and yet how are they agents who are producing the history that they're a part of? And for me, Anne Moody does a lot of work for me in thinking about how forces that we think of as fairly repressive, segregated education in the South. We don't need Foucault to tell us that school is a repressive, or Althusser, a repressive apparatus. And yet it can, because it gets caught up in its own discourses that are internally contradicted, it can produce an Anne Moody who says, wait a minute, I deserve everything. I'm the smartest, I'm the prettiest, I'm the most athletic, I'm the hardest working, I'm the honest. I mean, by the time we go through the superlatives, you're exhausted. And in the context of the 1950s and a post-war, Cold War ideology that says the reason America is great is because it's meritocratic, she develops an entirely different relationship to the nation state than her mother could have, not having been cut off from that. So I think that, for me, the novel does a lot of work in talking about how does individualism paradoxically get produced out of a collective, a very grassroots collective experience.
Thank you very much. We have time for a few questions.
We have a mic for you.
I'm sorry, I'm trying to get the mic. Thank you. Thank you.
In your comment, given the characteristics of British colonialism, divide and rule, whether you see the activism by these women as an attempt to also cut across regional boundaries, you know, between the North and South of Nigeria, and make an attempt at unification against the way the British, you know, left these kind of divisions, which still, you know, came out in the, you know, the recent election.
Sorry, I didn't get you very clearly. The characteristics of what?
That this British characteristic, particular British colonialism of divide and rule, and the regionalism that they left in place or emphasized, didn't de-emphasize, but you see the role of the women as also trying to cut across these regional divisions and make some kind of unity in that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That was one of the that was it's more of one of the additional factors you can talk about. You know, when the women came out agitating, for example, you can talk about the 1929 Aba Women's Riot, when women came out as a result of the colonial instruction or colonial policy that was put on ground. Women were exempted from, I think, paying tax, and they were not included in the census. And they felt that they had a right to be, and they came out all naked. They marched down the road trying to, you know, just buttress their points to the government that, look, because we are women in the country, we have rights, and we should be able to pay tax, not just pay tax, but also be counted as citizens of the nation. So definitely it was one of the factors that propelled, that was one of the things they set out to change, amongst others.
And in the northern part of Nigeria, up till 1979, women were disenfranchised. They were not allowed to vote, neither to be voted for. So these were the things. And in 1946 too, in Abeokuta, when the colonial masters were using the chiefs, you know, they became stooges to the colonial masters. They now began to act against the interest of their people. So the women turned around and said, wow, it's like the chiefs are now becoming more white than blacks. And so they couldn't tolerate it. The women in Abeokuta had to march naked to the Alaka of Abeokuta, and he got abdicated to the throne. And so these were the things that, you know, motivated the women to begin to stand up for their rights.
I just want to emphasize, though, that by the time Margaret Ekpo comes into power, this is almost the end of colonialism. So I would think it's also important to think about her as part of kind of national and nationalist politics in that period. And that is absolutely regional, and she was playing into that.
Thank you very much. As we see, we have a very, very thought-provoking panel, and I'm sure we'll continue the discussion later, but I'm being told that we have to go now. Thank you very, very much. Thank you.
Thank you.